Welcome to Leading Edge. I'm Jerry Anderson. School levies in Ohio. Those always tough hat-in-hand pleas by school districts that voters open their wallets to fund public education. I'm sure most of you have been through them. We're examining the process, as embattled as it is, that we all have to exist under, with the head of a very successful but challenged school district in a city in which education is the lead employer. But first, the latest on efforts to do something about our annually challenged water supply. We spent time on this subject with Ohio State Senator Randy Gardner last week. The same week, Toledo's mayor changed her position and agreed that the lake should be declared impaired. I'm joined by Lucas County Commissioner Carol Contrada and by University of Toledo Law Professor Ken Kilbert, who teaches, I read about you, environmental law, natural resources law, and water law. Who knew there is such a thing? There is water law. Sounds like the perfect person at my table. I have been asked, what would impaired declaration, an impaired declaration, mean? You know, we've heard the stories of a federal invasion, a blanket of just onerous regulations. We hear that Michigan has done the impaired declaration with little or no effect, and with any requested actions toward mitigation still being voluntary. So there's much to sort through. What flipped the mayor's position?
I think actually seeing that green algal bloom in the Maumee River at the heart of our city really made a difference for a lot of people, not just the mayor. It's almost enough is enough. We've been working on for a number of years since the water crisis of 2014, but many people have been working on it for decades before that. Right. Scientists, we know what the causes are, we know what the sources are, and it's time to do more than write papers. It's time to actually implement some of the tools that we know work for non-point source pollution.
We're going to talk about some of those solutions. The old algae came calling, so to speak, on us. I think there are all sorts of questions about whether such a declaration will ever take place, and we will explore that this morning. But if it were to happen, Professor, what exactly, legally, if you will, sir, does that mean?
Well, let me say first that I applaud the idea of a designation for Lake Erie as being impaired, but we have to be careful not to oversell it. It's not a silver bullet to solve all our problems. Basically, what Ohio does every year, obligated under the Clean Water Act, is to put a list of impaired waters, and that is their list, and they send that to US EPA every 2 years. Almost every water body in Ohio is on that list of impaired waters and has been for a number of years. But the open waters of Lake Erie have not been. And so whenever it's up to US EPA then to whether to approve that list or not, they did not, or they did approve Ohio's list without having.
But the lake wasn't on it.
Correct.
Okay, let's say they do at this time declare the lake impaired. What would happen? What would we see?
Yeah, it triggers what's known as a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, and basically that's a calculation of how much of the pollutant, in this case phosphorus, we can allow into the water to go on a daily basis without exceeding the water quality standard. And the applicable water quality standard here in Ohio is free from algae.
Okay. So, did he anticipate my next question? Total maximum daily load. How is that determined, though, in terms of what that load should be, and how do we determine whether we're exceeding that load?
It's a scientific calculation. I mean, this is what folks do with respect to biologists, hydrologists, et cetera, who are able to make this calculation as to what the allowance of phosphorus coming from both point sources and non-point sources going into the river, so that we are not going to have algae in that water, in the lake.
Go ahead, Carol.
One of the key factors that a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, brings to the table is a planning tool where you can look at all the sources in any given waterway or water body or watershed, and once you've determined what the total maximum daily load is in order to maintain healthy water, then you can start planning that load allocation and where those sources can come from, and how to mitigate sources that are perhaps contributing more than they should.
Let's just get on the list, because identifying sources seems to be key here. Is that what scares people?
I think so. We know where some of the sources are coming because they've been regulated for years under the Clean Water Act, and those are called point sources, such as wastewater treatment plants.
Wastewater treatment plant in Toledo.
Regulated CAFOs, they are permitted under the EPA. They have very strict limits. We know where those sources are coming from. But recently, there has been a mass balance study that's come out reviewing nutrients, and it's been identified that 84% of the nutrient pollution in the Maumee River is coming from non-point source pollution.
Defined as?
Anything that isn't regulated under the Clean Water Act, the EPA, that doesn't have
That would be fertilizer runoffs in agriculture.
It would be primarily agriculture, is correct, and in all of its forms.
All right. We have a lot of good players out there in agriculture. We've had people sit at our table, so there are probably some folks who are saying that you're not going to tell me how to run my business. So how do we find the bad actors? Is there a way to do that? If I go out and start, testing the water coming out of drainage tiles in rural, let's go Wood County since I live there. This ditch has too much phosphorus in it, but it runs for miles. How do I know who's over feeding phosphorus into that ditch?
That's certainly one of the challenges with respect to regulating non-point sources. It is more difficult than just sampling the end of a pipe coming out of a treatment plant. However, that doesn't mean that you just throw up your hands and stop trying, all right? And so there are various ways that could be done to sample. There are also things that could be done to, irrespective of the sampling, is to impose requirements like best management practices. The farmers often talk about doing the right thing at the right time with the right place. The idea of doing that voluntarily is great, but how about making some of that required so that all the farmers, not just those who want to play, but all farmers have to play?
What kind of hammer, read that enforcement, does an impaired declaration carry?
It doesn't have to be a hammer.
Okay.
It can be through incentives. In other words, farmers could, by agreeing to institute best management practices, and it's shown that of the suite of best management practices, many farms have at least one.
Yes.
But you might be able to get additional funding, you might be able to get tax credits. I mean, the world is wide open here to be able to incent farmers to do this.
Well, and you guys, did you both see Senator Gardner last week? I know you did, Professor. Mm-hmm. He talked about using Ohio's bonding authority to create some type of a wealth structure to, if you will, reimburse farmers for taking on the very actions we're talking about. We both support that?
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. We don't think that any one group should bear the financial burden of addressing what is a solution that we have to be able to sustain for a very long time, for generations. And when the Clean Water Act first came into being and we removed phosphorus from things like laundry detergent,
right.
The ratepayers who are tied into sanitary sewers, they assume the burden of treating wastewater treatment. So they've been paying for a while. But it's not fair to single out at this point one group over another and say you have to bear all the costs. And there are a lot of solutions really within government regulations, and that R word shouldn't be scary.
The impairment the declaration has to come from the U.S. EPA. We agree on that?
Not necessarily.
Oh!
Actually, it's Ohio EPA's call in the first place. They said no, and then it went up to the U.S. EPA, and they said okay to Ohio EPA.
Well,
so it's really the U.S. EPA could do it now, but there was nothing to stop Ohio EPA from designating its portion of the lake as impaired, just like Michigan did.
Well, Michigan did it, and the senator sat at this table last week and said, you know what, I see there's still no mandatory solution here. In fact, their voluntary stuff through their action plan, their state's action plan, is less strict than ours.
That's why we have to be careful when we talk about an impairment designation in a TMDL as somehow being an enforceable hammer. The state of Michigan does not have to rigorously enforce against non-point sources any more than they did before. Hopefully, they will get the idea to do so, because I agree with the Commissioner, the TMDL is a planning tool. And it's great to have a plan, but if you don't enforce the plan, it's not a much
You know, the first time I heard that phrase TMDL and what it meant? Do you know who it was?
Possibly at the Rotary Convention.
I actually heard it the month after the Toledo water crisis from a young lady by the name of Sandy Bin, who happens to live out there on the bay, and said, Jerry, until we get to, and that was 2014.
We have been talking about it since the Rotary Convention.
Rotary Convention has been great. We were there covering
Yes.
for our first met you, Professor. All right. My guest, County Commissioner Carroll, Contrada Law Professor Kenneth Kilbert, talking water and impaired water sources. Professor, always good to see you. Thank you very much. I have some other county stuff I want to talk about. Can you have